Welcome to the 40 to 40 podcast. Join me, your host John Weiser, as I explore life 40 degrees south of the equator. Welcome to the 40/40 podcast, episode number 3, and we're going to get into every HR manager's favorite topic, which is politics. So last episode, episode 2, we went into inflation, and we ended with a few questions. Basically, why is it so complicated? Why is there this high demand for dollars and a limited supply of dollars? And who are these ones who are putting the rules on everything, who are creating different types of dollars for all the different situations of importation or using your credit card or going to an official exchange house? To answer that question, we have to get into politics, because the politicians are obviously the ones who are controlling the central bank and controlling some aspects of what's causing inflation. A little bit of a history of politics in Argentina, because I think most of my audience right now doesn't know too much about that. And Thomas Sowell is a economist who I enjoy reading because I think he's an excellent communicator, and he's helped me to understand some of the economic topics, at least from his perspective. He has 2 books that I think are relevant to a discussion about politics. One is A Conflict of Visions, and the other one is Intellectuals and Society. And he proposes that basically there's 2 presuppositions that cause different political outcomes. One is the constrained version of man or the unconstrained version of man. So unconstrained, you can see that as essentially someone who is saying man has the ability to fix everything, and if man has the power to do so, they should use that power to fix problems. So think, for example, if somebody is in a position of power in politics, in a government, and they see poverty, they should use the tool of government to fix a problem. Because we are unconstrained, we can find solutions. And the constrained version is saying man is limited in their understanding of the situation, they're limited in their ability. We should decentralize control what one man can do, and allow every man to see their situation and try to make the right decision, because each person has the specific knowledge where they are. So it's 2 very different presuppositions that then cause different outcomes. And as we get into politics, I want to be as objective as possible, to just look at this as more of a case study. My opinion doesn't really matter, because I can't vote down here. I won't be able to be a citizen for several years, from my understanding, and that's fine. But it's interesting to understand it, and it's interesting just to observe it and see what we can learn from it. So 1946, there's a gentleman named Peron. He comes to power, democratically elected, and he starts what's known as Peronism. And the Peronism essentially is in power, interrupted by some military dictators who take power several times during that period. I don't remember. There's some people who are elected who are not Peronist, but they never complete their terms. And so some notable names are obviously are Peron, and then one of his wives becomes president at one point. In 1989, Menem becomes president. He's notable. We mentioned him in the previous episode. He's notable because he is the one who pegged the dollar and the peso during the 90s, and there was some success with that. It ended up falling apart in 2002, but there was some success with that during his presidency. In 2003, Kirchner becomes president, and then in 2007, his wife, Cristina Fernandez Kirchner, who's perhaps more famous than him, becomes president, and she's president for 2 terms, for 8 years, which is significant. In 2015, there's a character named Macri. He's a businessman. In some ways, he's a parallel to Trump. And he becomes the first democratically elected non-Peronist to complete his term. In almost 80 years since Peron started in 1946. He gets to the end of his term, things are not that better, he struggles to get reelected. A gentleman named Fernandez becomes president for 4 years, very unpopular. And then this year, Milei wins the presidency in kind of a 3-way race against the conservative candidate Boric, the Peronist candidate Massa, and then Milei representing for the first time the Libertarian Party here in Argentina. One interesting, helpful comment, or one helpful perspective before we get into all of this comes from the book A Constitutional Liberty by Friedrich Hayek. And Hayek is actually one of the people that Milei looks to for the foundation of his thought. But I was reading A Constitutional Liberty, And Hayek says in there that essentially a politician cannot be a new idea person. A politician needs to be somebody who understands the majority and then presents himself in such a way to win a majority in a democracy. And so that's logical, right? A new idea, by the nature of being new, doesn't have a majority accepting it yet. And so to be a politician who's focused on the new idea and being radical is difficult to win a majority. A politician who's just focused on getting power tries to find a way to present himself in such a way that he can get a voting majority to get him back into power. So if we look at that, it's going to be interesting to see how Milei in some ways defies that principle, but he was able to find a way to be politically savvy enough to win a majority. All right, that's the broad history of Argentina in the past 80 years. The immediate history, from my experience with it, starts in March. In March, I had a trip with some friends down to Argentina, and this is the first time I heard about Milei. His face was on some posters. There's a lot of posters on the billboards, on all the fences as you go down the roads here. And I thought it was interesting because he had this crazy hair, which is very notable. And so I was like, who is this guy? And I find out he's a Libertarian candidate. And I start to ask some questions, and essentially he's explaining to the masses how the opposing party has used the government as a tool to enrich themselves while using those resources to ensure that they maintain power. So he has this narrative that he's telling. I'm not saying that I agree with this, but he's telling us a narrative, and he's starting to communicate in a way that people say, this makes sense. So he's explaining to them, a politician is taking their tax dollars and they're using it to give benefits to people so those people vote for them. And so they're just trying to find, they're trying to win voting blocks, right? And so again, it's his narrative, and he's starting to communicate this idea. He's also explaining how the government has used debt-financed social programs to try to win votes. And then when they can't pay off this debt, they print more and more money in order to pay off the debt. And what does that do? That causes inflation, and it hurts anybody who's saving in pesos. So essentially, it's a type of wealth tax. And so he's presenting this idea, and people are starting to understand it. They're starting to say, this makes sense. He's explaining how we've gotten here. At the same time, I read a book called Mao's Great Famine by Frank de Kuyter, and I'm really drawn to this idea of decentralization of power, because if you ever read the book, or if you know anything about the famine, Mao puts himself in a position where he has absolute power in China, and he makes decisions. And whether those decisions are right or wrong, or whether he's a good or bad person, is kind of irrelevant. But what's important is that one person was able to make decisions that everyone else followed, and the outcome of those decisions was that it's estimated between 40 and 60 million people died during that famine. So it's kind of terrifying to think that one person takes on that much power and is fully listened to without question. If they make a mistake, the consequences of the mistake is magnified. Whereas if power is decentralized, if one person makes a mistake, there's a limitation to what can happen to that. So I'm drawn to this idea. It's kind of the first time in my life that I've read something like this, that I started to find out about it. And it ties in with the libertarian topics that Milei is talking about. So I'm very interested in him. I go back to the United States. I finish what I have to do in the United States. And then in August, there's a primary election, which I didn't understand what this was at first. But what happens is everybody is on the ballot who wants to be on the ballot. And so what you have is you have Milei representing the Libertarian Party. But for the Conservative Party, it's Bullrich and the other candidate. And so what they do is they vote for Bullrich and they vote for the other candidate. And whoever gets the most votes gets to be the one that represents the party. So you not only get to see how many people in the nation like Milei, but you also decide who is the candidate for the Conservative Party and for the Peronist Party. The outcome of that is that Milei gets 30% of the vote. Bullrich only gets 16%, but her party gets 28% of the vote. Massa gets 21%, but his party gets 27%. So in order, it's Milei, 30%. The Conservative Party, 28%, and then the Peronist Party at 27%. And so it looks like there's this massive change where the smallest percentage, 27%, is the Peronist Party, who's been in control for the past 8 years, and everyone's very surprised by that. So after the primary, the government decides to devalue the official peso, since it looks imminent that Milei is going to come in and cause massive changes. And so the peso gets devalued the next day by 18%. In September, they have the presidential debates. And what was really interesting, I was listening. I don't understand everything in Spanish, but I'm listening. I understand a majority. The main topic of the debate is not what are the ideas of Bullrich, the conservative candidate? What are the ideas of Massa, the Peronist candidate? No, the main topic of the debate is what are Milei's ideas and why they're so bad. And this is incredibly important because Milei comes to the debate as the one person who says, this is what I would do, this is what I think is wrong, this is my proposal. And everyone else just comes to the debate with, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. But if you say, okay, Mrs. Bullrich, what would you do? Or Massa, what is your plan to stop inflation? There was never a clear answer. It was always this, this is the most serious problem and we're going to make a plan. And so even if Milei is 100% wrong, I at least value somebody who's speaking clearly. So that's my takeaway from the debates. We get to the October elections and something happened that I didn't expect. Massa, who had gotten 27%, his party had gotten 27% during the primaries, Massa gets 36% and is the top candidate in the first election. Milei gets 30%, so he goes from 30% to 30%. He has a super strong voting base at 30%. And then Bullrich, whose party had won 28%, Bullrich is only able to get 23%. So she's not even able to consolidate all the votes within her own party. And then all the other candidates were represented 11%. During that night, the crypto dollar, which is an interesting thing. So if you're on Binance or a crypto platform, you have person-to-person trading, and you literally are looking at a person who is saying, I will buy $1 for 1,000 pesos. And the next person says, no, I'll buy $1 for 1,100 pesos. And the next person says, no, I'll buy $1 for 1,200 pesos. And so you literally have this open market where the price of the dollar and the peso is changing actively. That went up as high as 1,300 that night. And before that, I think the official was close to 700 or 800. So there's this massive speculation that's happening during the election night, which is something interesting to watch. Then in November, Argentina has what's called a ballotage. And so in the Argentina Constitution, a president can win with 40% if he has a 10% gap between him and the next candidate. So if Massa had won 40% and Milei had won 29%, let's say, Massa would have won in the first election. But because Massa won 36% and Milei won 30%, there's only a 6% gap, and then Massa did not arrive to that 40% target. Because of that, there's what's called a ballotage or a runoff. And during the ballotage, Milei partners with the conservative candidate. So he does a political move. He partners with the conservative candidate. He's hugging her on television. She's endorsing him because they're coming together to try to beat this reigning Peronist power. And he's able to get 56% of the vote, which is significant. And Massa is only able to get the remaining 44%. Dollar blue. The day after the election, the next business day after the election, dollar blue, which is that unofficial, the unofficial exchange rate that you can get at an unofficial exchange house, goes from 950 to 1,075. December 10th is the day that Milei does the assumption, is the term that they use here. So he assumes the position of president. I actually went to Buenos Aires to watch it because it was a historic event. And the night before, some of the fans of Milei got together and they performed a funeral for the central bank. So they're sitting there and they have like a wreath of flowers. They have an obituary that they pass out, and it's very comical. But again, it represents his fanatic fan base, who's creative and who's very excited about the opportunity to see change. And then during the day of the Assumption on December 10th, you have thousands of supporters who go to the Congress building and who watch Milei be sworn in. And then Milei goes down the street, passes them, and they're all freaking out and trying to get a good view of him. He goes to the Pink House, which is the Argentine version of the White House, and he addresses his supporters from the balcony, and then several hours later he comes out and walks to the church where he has a religious ceremony there. December 10th, during the Assumption, I actually ran into Congressman from California, Congressman Dana Rohrabacher. And he was there for the same reason as me. He recently lost his last election. He decided to travel the world and surf and spend more time with his family, which I think is awesome. And he was very approachable, and so we spoke for a while. And he told me that he was a libertarian-leaning Republican when he was in Congress, and he wanted to go and see the first libertarian president of a major country during this ceremony. So that was great to run into someone who I could speak to in English and enjoy the day, but also really cool to meet a congressman who had a similar interest in the situation. One last notable point about Milei's followers or Milei's fans was that during all this ceremony, what typically happens is you have vendors who are handing out food, who are handing out water bottles. It's a very hot day, and in any big event, what's going to happen? Someone's going to drop their water bottle. They're not going to find a trash can. It's just typical. And what Milei supporters did is they literally walked around with big trash bags, and I was walking down the street with an empty water bottle, and they said, "Hey, can I take that from you?" And so when you're walking away from the plaza, the whole group walks away. You look back, absolutely clean, just green grass, no trash whatsoever. And it was a strong statement to volunteerism and to what Milei is proposing and what some of his supporters are already trying to help him implement. During this time, international coverage of Milei's used words like far right, libertarian, radical, extreme, dangerous, outsider, anarcho-capitalist. After his assumption, there was a note from President Nicolas Maduro from Venezuela that he put out a comment saying that he was concerned with the rights of Argentines. So there's that. But why did Argentines elect Milei with a significant margin? I've heard some people talk about this and they say, I just don't understand. How could this happen? I ran into a lady, we were at the art museum, and she was very nice, she spoke English, and she had a lot of fear about Milei, and she said, I don't understand how he won. He's so crazy. I see him as so crazy. But as I think about it, if you think back to episode 2, you have what I would call hopeless inflation. You have somebody who can save $100,000 in the 1990s, and if you were to leave that as just physical paper, it would be worth $80 today, okay? You have people who are tired of being unproductive and inefficient, and not by choice, who are tired of being forced to be that way. You have exchange rate games, if you will. You have different rates for every different situation. You have counting money games. So you go to buy $100 worth of groceries and you have to pay for it in bills that cost 10 cents per bill, and you're sitting there counting. And you have to call out a manager to help count all the bills. And you have Argentines who are asking questions like, well, what is the purpose of government? Does government need to fix every single problem, or should government allow us to be free enough to fix our own problems? And so when you put yourself in the shoes of Argentine, considering inflation, to me, it does not seem extreme that they voted for someone who understood their primary pain point and explained why it happened and explained what he would do to fix it. If there's anything that I think Milei has done excellently, it was communication. He understood how to speak to the public in such a way that he got their attention, and he understood how to speak to them in such a way that the message was received. So the first thing he did was that he listened. He saw that the biggest problem that affects the most people, that gets the people the most passionate, is inflation. And then he communicated to them using tools like a chainsaw, saying he's going to cut down spending because we have too much spending, too much debt. The only way to stop increasing the debt and start paying off the debt is to decrease the spending. So there's this visual communication tool. Now, what's interesting about that is that he's using a tool that gathered an extreme base to him, this 30%, who was very faithful to him, but he alienated the conservatives who said, a presidential candidate shouldn't be holding a chainsaw, he shouldn't be cursing at someone he disagrees with during a debate, he shouldn't be too crazy, he should be more regular, more normal. But he understood that if he won a 30% base, he would go to ballotage. And he understood that in the ballotage, he would win the majority of the conservative vote to vote for him. So by understanding the primary issue, by communicating to win that 30% vote, he then set himself up for a political strategy to win the in-between people who thought he was too crazy, and therefore have that 56% margin versus the 44% margin of the Peronist. So not only was he an excellent communicator, but as far as I can see, he was an excellent political strategist to say, how can I make a plan that takes power from the Peronists who have been in power for 80 years? Now, if you want to get to know more about Milei, there's two resources that I think are helpful to hear exactly what he says and not someone else's opinion about him. Search the Tucker Carlson interview of Milei, and Tucker Carlson asks him some questions about what he believes, what he's doing, and Milei, in his own words, answers in Spanish and is translated into English, and it's quite helpful. The other speech that he just gave that got a lot of attention recently was that he went to the WEF, the World Economic Forum, and he gave another speech that was translated into English. And you can see that he doesn't come across as crazy. He comes across as somebody who is principled, who's read books and gathered an opinion and now wants to apply that into a situation. So in summary, I might be wrong, and if I am, I'd appreciate responses, but in summary, I see the political landscape like this. There's a significant portion of the population who's hungry to be more productive, to be able to save, to be able to have a better future for their children. And they believe that Milei will take the steps at least in the right direction to get them there. And then there's a significant portion of the population who fear Milei and strongly disagree with his approach. And then in general, I see a lingering tiredness and hopelessness. So some people, you talk to them and they say, it doesn't matter if it's Milei, it doesn't matter if it's Massa. It's all the same eventually. So I would say that tiredness and hopelessness has come from the inflation and from some of the situations here. Tied with this energetic optimism, maybe it can better. And then there's awareness that, it's not going to be easy, right? To get out of the debt situation, to open up new lines of credit, to try to get rid of some of the policies maybe that are hurting growth, not going to be easy. And so lingering tiredness and hopelessness with an energetic optimism and an awareness of a very difficult struggle in the short term. So again, if you disagree with me, or if you have anything you think that I'm missing or misunderstanding at the very least, reach out to me, because that's the only way I can change my own opinion, and I'd be open to discuss it and try to understand it better. Thank you for joining me for this episode on politics, kind of bringing the idea of inflation and politics to a close here for now, and we'll get back into it later. But next episode, I'm really excited for two things. We're going to start to talk about Neoken and what the situation of inflation and politics looks like specifically in Neoken. And I'm bringing on our first guest, so I can stop doing all the talking. So join me next week for episode 4, when we get into living in Neoken.